Hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here with you for Arcadia Economics, and really excited to have a good friend and special guest, really, my opinion, a heroic figure in this whole gold and silver story, which has such a great impact on the economy, is going to have an impact going forward. Not always an easy thing to speak up about, which is why I really admire Chris Powell of Gata, who is kind enough to join us today, a couple days before Christmas, to do a recap of what's been going on this year in the gold and silver space. So Chris, how are you today, my friend? It's great to have you on here.
Oh, delighted to be with you again, Chris.
Yeah, so as we wrap up 2019, we've seen a lot of wild things, petro yuans, countries making arrangements to trade outside of the dollar. And perhaps most relevant to gold and silver, the big news in the past month was that former JP Morgan trader John Edmunds did plead guilty to manipulating gold and silver, which I won't make you say, but certainly you were saying this for years. So nice to see that vindicated, and curious your thoughts on the case and anything that's happened so far with that and how it might play out.
Well, Edmunds' sentencing has been postponed into next year, which is kind of interesting. It suggests that the Justice Department wants more time to get more out of him, or at least to assure his cooperation. The really interesting thing to me about the Edmunds case was that, according to the Justice Department statement about his plea bargain, he was rigging the monetary metals markets with the full knowledge and approval of his supervisors. Now, of course, this was during the time when the famous Blythe Masters was head of the JP Morgan Commodities Office. I hope the Justice Department has some interest in discussing this matter with her. But also interesting in connection with Edmunds is that while this was going on, Blythe Masters gave an interview to CNBC in which she addressed complaints and suspicions that Morgan Chase was rigging the monetary metals markets. And Masters told CNBC that JP Morgan did not trade the metals markets for its own book, but was trading the metals markets only for clients. Of course, CNBC did not have the wit to ask her, well, who are those clients, and do they include any US government agencies like the Federal Reserve or Treasury Department or Exchange Stabilization Fund? But the implication was clearly there that Morgan was acting as a broker for somebody, and Morgan has very close association with the US government. The US government uses Morgan all the time for interventions in the market and in public. So I have to wonder if Edmunds was trading and rigging the monetary metals markets with the knowledge of his supervisors, right up to, presumably to Blythe Masters. Were they front-running US government trades or the trades of other governments? I mean, that has always been a great concern about government intervention in the markets through intermediaries. If the intermediaries are doing it as the government's brokers, so the government can keep its fingerprints off the dirty deeds it's doing, what prevents the intermediary brokers from front-running the government trades? And the government trades can't be defeated. The government has access to infinite money. So I'm a little curious as to and surprised why the government busted this guy at Morgan, considering Morgan's close connections to the government. We're just going to have to wait and see. But at least this confession by the Morgan trader ought to generate a little curiosity in the financial press and among monetary metals markets analysts and newsletter writers as to what was really going on here. Of course, it won't. This is a prohibited subject that can be discussed only in out-of-the-way places, like our discussion here today, but there's a lot of questions that ought to come out of this, and I wish that the mainstream financial news organizations would pursue them.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting what you mentioned there, Chris, and actually reminds me, are you familiar with Dr. Dave Janda?
Oh, I know of him. I have not heard his show, but our Gata board member, Ed Steer, has been on his program very often.
Yeah, he's mentioned that really what the whole big circus behind the Kavanaugh thing was about was basically that gave a majority of the judges that were actually going to install the rule of law. Now, whether this is, I think Dave is pretty well researched, so is likely to be right when the way he phrased that. So I found it interesting that shortly after that was when we had John Edmunds. We also had some other events that at least could lead, if that theory is correct, hopefully maybe this is a sign that, all right, now the crimes that are being committed, whether financial or political, someone's going to go after them. And again, like you mentioned, it was interesting. Part of the confession was that it was done with knowledge of his superiors and widespread practice within the firm. And I'm curious, I know you're close and read Ted Butler, who mentioned how I believe he contacted the FBI a couple months ago, and now the Department of Justice has become involved. And Ted has been writing that he gets the feeling, and I've had the feeling as well, that they seem a lot more serious than the CFTC. Any thoughts on whether you think they're getting to the heart of the matter there?
I don't know, Chris. I have to confess my surprise. I would have never expected a charge against a Morgan trader for manipulating the gold and silver markets, unless somehow it was intended to distract from the real party of interest, at least the real party of interest in my opinion, which is the US government and other governments. But I mean, why would this guy Edmunds take the fall in a scheme to distract from US government intervention in the markets? I don't know. I don't have an explanation for everything here, any more than I have an explanation for everything else going on in the markets. I have only questions and a fair memory for the documents we have collected confirming surreptitious central bank intervention in the monetary metals markets. But Ted Butler has been shouting about Morgan's misconduct for years and years and years, and daring the investment bank to sue him for libel. And of course, that hasn't happened. And I think he has been as safe as anybody against a libel suit as anybody could be. You can, when you've got a mafia gangster, you can put in the papers anything you want about him, whether it's true or untrue. Well, a lot of stuff may be true, but you can say any untrue thing you want about him as well, because he'll never sue, because if he sues, the defendant gets to go through all the plaintiff's records and to interview all his friends under oath and to depose people and discover evidence. And the defendant may be wrong about a specific allegation that's being litigated, but he'll get to go through all the records and all the witnesses who might be against the plaintiff, and the plaintiff can never sustain that. So just as you can say anything you want about a mafia gangster, if he's really a gangster, I think you can say just about anything you want about market rigging by J.P. Morgan, because they would never permit discovery and deposition in a lawsuit about market rigging, because you'd be bound to find something, even if it wasn't exactly what you were looking for. So Ted has been very courageous about this, but I think he's also been very safe, because when he describes J.P. Morgan Chase as a criminal organization in regard to the markets, he's absolutely right.
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot, because he does write about that, and it's been interesting seeing how there's just been no response to that. So be fascinating to see how that plays out. Because my view has been, and actually it was interesting, I heard Bart Chilton talking about this in an interview a couple days ago, where he was saying he did believe there was manipulative behavior, felt that he didn't have the evidence to prove it, but I'm curious your opinion. I would think that between, if you interview Ted, if you speak to you and Bill Murphy and some of these other experts, and then add on that if you're the Department of Justice and then can go and look at the trading records, I mean, for us, we're putting a lot of pieces together, but if you're the government and have legal access to the trading records, I would think that a proper investigation, is it reasonable to say that if a proper investigation is done, there's not much mystery about what's going on here and the ability to prove it?
Well, the government certainly could get any documentation it wanted over Morgan if it applied itself and wanted to fight any objections by Morgan. But regarding Bart Chilton, who was on the Commodity Futures Trading Commission for many years and who was instrumental in forcing the commission to give Gata a forum at a hearing they did some years ago about monetary metals prices. Bart said on that show the other day, as he was interviewing London metals trader Andrew Maguire, that yes, he thought that there was manipulation in the silver market, and that the CFTC had found evidence of it during its long investigation of silver manipulation, but they didn't find enough evidence that would allow them to bring charges against a particular person. I want to ask the CFTC, and in fact, we have asked the CFTC and got brushed away a few weeks ago. Does the Commodity Futures Trading Commission's jurisdiction extend to trading done by the U.S. government or a government agency or by a broker representing the U.S. government? That is market rigging by the U.S. government legal or illegal? We know from the filings with the SEC and the CFTC itself by CME Group, which operates all the major commodity exchanges in the United States, that central banks and governments secretly trade all the futures contracts on CME Group exchanges. And not only that, but the CME Group extends volume trading discounts to governments and central banks that surreptitiously trade futures contracts in the United States. So some months ago, Gata wrote to the CFTC asking a whole bunch of questions, including questions about this explosion of the exchange for physicals mechanism of settling gold and silver contracts on the New York Commodities Exchange. But we also asked the Commission in a separate letter whether its jurisdiction extended to trading in the futures markets by the U.S. government or government agencies or brokers representing the government. Of course, the CFTC did not answer us for months. I finally prevailed on my U.S. representative, John Larson, here in Connecticut, to prod the Commission. Would you please answer this guy? Right. And well, finally, in a letter dated December 12th, I got a letter back from the Commission, but it was just a form letter. It didn't acknowledge any of our specific questions. It just said, thanks for expressing your concerns, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission has this, obligation, what we do. And it was a letter they could have sent to anybody. It ignored our questions. It did not explain what's going on with the exchange for physicals mechanism. It did not even tell us, did not even answer whether the Commodity Futures Trading Commission considers that it has jurisdiction over trading by the U.S. government. Well, to give such a brush off to somebody, even after his U.S. representative asks that the Commission provide an answer, suggests to me that these questions are just too sensitive to answer. Yeah. I mean, what if it was formally acknowledged, not just in those dense filings with the SEC and the CFTC, but by an executive of the Commission, that the U.S. government is secretly trading the futures markets? I think even the mainstream financial news organizations would have a hard time ignoring that, though they'd probably manage. But I don't think the markets generally, I don't think futures traders generally, I don't think the world generally understands that the governments are secretly trading the futures markets in a scheme to control commodity prices and to divert inflation out of real goods and into financial assets. The British economist Peter Warburton discerned this in an essay he wrote back in 2001. He hypothecated that governments and central banks easily could control the commodity markets through derivatives with just a few $1 billion on the table. So, here we asked the CFTC some specific questions. What's going on with these exchange for physicals? Are these genuine trades? Are they just accounting gimmicks to conceal manipulation of the market? Does the commission have jurisdiction over trading by the U.S. government or its brokers? We can't get an answer.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I'm sure you're familiar with James McDonald, one of the newer commissioners. I guess he's been there about a year.
Yes, I'm aware of him.
Did you ever happen to catch any of those podcasts he's done on the CFTC?
Yeah, one he was, praising the commission for its transparency and for, as I recall, praising traders who came forward to admit their firm's manipulation of the markets. Obviously, it was all just propaganda. I mean, ask them a specific question. Do you have jurisdiction over trading by the U.S. government? Are you aware of trading in the futures markets by the U.S. government? You can't get an answer.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder if you or Bill were able to get through one of those without throwing something around the house, because it was incredible. He sits there saying, we want to know when there's inappropriate behavior, yet I know Ted's sending him his letters every week. I know a lot of people have contacted him, and personally felt that was a bit disingenuous to say, we want the information, we want people to speak out. You've dedicated your life to doing that. I left a career on Wall Street to do that, and yet here is one of these public regulatory agencies doing the same thing that the SEC did with the Bernie Madoff scandal when Harry Markopoulos, he wasn't just saying this is a scam, he was doing the math for him, sending the charts, proving it 8 million different ways. Again, the fact that he gets 1.2% return every month could have been a clue there.
Yeah, well, the other point here is that the CFTC was conducting its supposed investigation of silver market manipulation for many of the years during which the Morgan trader Edmunds has just admitted rigging the silver market. One of our questions to the CFTC is, how did you miss this?
Right.
I mean, how did your investigation miss what the Justice Department has just gotten a confession to? Of course, that question has not been answered yet either.
Let alone, why have they not opened a new investigation when, I mean, if the Deutsche Bank trading records, the chat transcript, where these guys are giggling about smoking the price of silver, and I believe they say the same about gold. I focus more on the silver ones, but all right, we had that 2 years ago. Here's another guy pleading guilty, saying it was widespread practice.
Well, I can think of an answer to the question. The possible answer to the question is, well, we bumped into it, but we thought these brokers were really trading at the behest of the U.S. government or another government with the U.S. government's approval. That's a possible answer,
Yeah.
but that's only speculation. But the beginning question is: are governments trading the futures markets in the United States surreptitiously, as suggested by CME Group's filings with the CFTC and the SEC? We can't get an answer to that question. We can't even get that question acknowledged. We can't get the commission to say, yes, we have your question, go screw yourself.
Yeah, and perhaps for the folks who may be newer to this saga and don't know as much of the history, I was wondering if you could give a quick recap of what happened. I think it was back in 2010, after Andrew Maguire had written the letter to, I think it was Max Ramirez, where he said, hey, the market's manipulated. This is how it works. I'm going to tell you what happens before the labor report comes out. Played out exactly as he said. And I believe him and it was Adrian Douglas, right?
Yes, that's right.
We're supposed to appear at the meeting with the CFTC. And then there was this, I think a day before, they uninvited McGuire. A lot of his interviews were canceled, and I believe he was hit by a car as well. Since you're an expert on this, rather than me guessing, if you could just recap whether that's correct.
Well, McGuire did contact the CFTC and did have long exchanges with the CFTC investigator, laid out, even on a prospective basis, how the market would be rigged at certain times by certain trading desks. That, came to pass. He showed the CFTC how it was being done, and even identified at least one instance where it would be done, where it did come to pass. McGuire did not testify to the CFTC. However, Bill Murphy, our chairman, and Adrian Douglas, who was then a member of our committee, who unfortunately has since died, did testify to the CFTC. Bill had a very long statement to read. He did not have much time to read it in, and so he read it very quickly.
I remember that.
And while the CFTC's cameras were rolling, for some reason, the audio went blank during much of Bill's testimony, which was a really suspicious thing. But Murphy and Douglas did get the rigging testimony, or the rigging information that McGuire was providing was put on the record in the CFTC hearing. And that happened only because Bart Chilton insisted on the commission's letting Murphy and Douglas talk. That would, let me turn that off there. I think we owe a huge debt of gratitude to Bart Chilton, who probably put himself at great risk by insisting that Gata be heard. Now, I know a lot of people think Chilton didn't do enough, or he was secretly, not secretly, that he was on the other side. I don't think so. I think Chilton put himself at the greatest possible political risk by insisting that the commission hear Gata. And I'm grateful to him, and I hope others will be. Now, could he have done more? Could he have risked assassination more? Very possibly. I think Chilton probably knows a little more than he's telling. If I ever appear on his show on his Boom Bust program now on Russia Today, I would like to turn it into an interview with Bart Chilton.
Yeah.
I would like to ask Bart, without embarrassing him too much, does the CFTC know if the U.S. government is trading the futures markets in the United States directly or through intermediaries? And does the commission have jurisdiction over that trading, or is that trading exempt from the commission's jurisdiction because of the Gold Exchange Act of 1934, which explicitly authorizes the U.S. government through the Exchange Stabilization Fund to trade secretly and rig any market in the world? I suspect Bart Chilton knows the answers to those questions. Now, whether he would answer those questions or feel that he could answer those questions, or whether he has some enduring obligation to the commission not to reveal confidential things, I don't know. But if Chilton didn't spill all the beans, Chilton took a huge risk by assuring that Gata would be heard at a very high level of the United States government. And for that, he's a hero.
Yeah, it's interesting. I did email the commissioners. I think this was back in 2011. He was the only one who wrote back, but basically said, you can look at my comments referencing where he said he believes it's manipulated, but that it takes 3 out of 5 votes to pass anything. So agree with what you said, and I'll contact him. Maybe we could get a 3-way chat going here, and that could be fun. Certainly learn a lot. Although perhaps in wrapping up, Chris, last question for you. I spend probably far too much of my waking hours thinking about how this could possibly end. My understanding is that for each piece of physical metal, we're in the hundreds in terms of paper claims. of how much paper is out there per piece of metal. So in terms of how this ends, I've always thought, you could have a situation where if there's some surge in investment demand, people show up, say, I want my physical metal, and eventually they run out, or some sort of force majeure on the COMEX. My understanding is the way the contracts are worded that, let's say you have government comes out and says whatever, and silver opens up trading $50, but that the COMEX can settle people to cash. I'm not sure if there's any other possibilities I've been able to figure out. Am I missing any there? Is it almost inevitable that one of those happens?
My best guess is this will end in a revaluation of gold by central banks. These currency revaluations happen from time to time regularly in a fiat money system. They are necessary in a fiat money system to prevent interest obligations from devouring the world economy. We have currency revaluations every 30 or so years ago. The one was basically triggered by the collapse of the London gold pool in 1968. My guess is that when the physical offtake has reached a point where it is in danger of exhausting the central bank gold reserves that central banks don't want to lose in the price rigging scheme, that at that point, central banks will get together and on a Sunday night announce that they are revaluing gold upward substantially. You can pick a number, that they will purchase gold at this new price. And by purchasing gold at this substantially higher price, they will get back much of the gold that they have swapped and leased and sold into the market in the price control scheme of the previous 50 years. And they will begin another 50 years of gold price control. People who have gold may be happier because they will be rewarded somewhat for their holding it with a higher price. On the other hand, if central banks really want to get even more totalitarian, they can confiscate gold, or as Jim Rickards has observed, central banks, governments can impose a windfall profits tax on gold holders or silver holders or both of them to recapture most of the capital gains. I don't think every country in the world would do that, but I wouldn't put it past the United States government. I wouldn't put it past the Venezuelan government. There's things governments can do, but I think in the end, when the offtake just becomes too much for them, and when perhaps, say, Russia and China have found that inexpensive gold is no longer available to them, they will pull the plug, tell the BIS and the other central banks they're pulling the plug. They are ready to revalue gold, and central banks will make it look like that they're still in charge here, that they are the ones that revalued gold upward for the public good and to reliquify themselves, that their hand was not forced by the retail market or by their own irresponsibility with money creation over the last century. I don't think central banks and governments will permit a disorderly unraveling of the gold price suppression scheme where the market controls what the gold price is. But that's only a guess, Chris. We're going to continue to work toward a free and transparent market in the monetary metals. I'm sure governments will continue to work against it until the end of time. And people will just have to decide which side they're on.
Yeah, and Chris, you described what Bart Chilton has done as courageous and heroic. I would say certainly that applies to what you're doing. So I'm really grateful for all the information you share yourself and through Gata. Perhaps just in wrapping up, can let folks know how they can find you. And it's an incredible, frustrating at times, but truly fascinating. And I love getting your Gata posts every day. You have I found out about London and Venezuela and their little gold spat first from you guys. So it's a great site, and really encourage people to support what you're doing if they want integrity back in the market. So if you could just let them know how to find that.
Sure. Our internet site, Chris, is gata.org, Gata.org. We tend to put out a few dispatches every day. These are news stories and commentaries that may be of interest to people who are invested in the monetary metals or just interested in the currency markets generally. If you go to gata.org and look in the right column, you can subscribe to our dispatches there. We are a educational and civil rights organization registered with the Internal Revenue Service, recognized as a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So financial contributions to Gata are federally tax exempt in the United States. People can contribute to Gata on our internet site. There's a credit card mechanism there. There's also my address is Secretary and Treasurer of Gata. If you rather send a check, you can do that with the information on our internet site. We have spoken at some international conferences that were not really as popular lately as we used to be. The mining industry does not want to know very much about this scheme.
Which is amazing.
Does not necessarily help them sell shares. And while I think there's enormous potential for the monetary metals and the companies that mine them, investors have to realize that they're up against central banking, they're up against governments, and that if gold and silver are going to the moon, it didn't happen yesterday, and it hasn't happened over the last few years. It will not; those prices will not be liberated without a struggle. So the monetary metals mining industry is not terribly supportive of Gata right now. So we just appeal to investors generally to help us with our research and our agitation. Anybody who's interested in free markets, transparent, limited accountable government, those are the people we have to appeal to, and we certainly could use their financial help.
Yeah, well, hopefully maybe for Christmas we can get some of those folks who are paying for that Wall Street Journal subscription to reallocate over to Gata. I mean, as a trader, I think you're going to have a much better return on your investment there anyway. And Chris, again, I do appreciate all that you do. It's been a pleasure getting to know you this year and having a couple of these conversations. So I want to wish you, Gata, Bill, and your families a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. Thanks again for joining me, and we'll look forward to some good news in the silver market soon.
Same to you, Chris.